Today we're here to talk about marriage, and the problem is you're already saturated with marriage information, right? You've probably heard more sermons on marriage than any other topic in the church, but there's a lot to be said. But what I'm going after this morning is the essence of marriage, the very core, the substance. What is marriage at its root? Because if we get this wrong, it's like trying to do marriage without a map, and we've all been there. Well, marriage ministry is far too challenging without a map. Marriage has the potential for deep joy and belly laughter like nothing else, but it also has the potential to bring us to a place of insanity and deep sorrow, intense emotions that we didn't even know we were capable of feeling. Why? Why does marriage have the potential to do this to us, to take us to places that we don't want to go? And why is marriage ministry so challenging? We can feel, when we're trying to help a couple, we can feel like a child who is watching his very own parents get ready to collide, like a train that's going to collide, and I'm sitting there helpless to stop it. You see, emotions in marriage are powerful. They have the potential both to separate, to pull apart, to tear apart, or to pull closely together, to invite compassion and to create intimacy. But the power and intensity of marital emotion is what leads many of us to think twice before we jump into the fray of marital ministry. We think either I'm not gifted enough, I don't have the right training, or have to be half crazy to do this more than I absolutely have to do. But here's why getting to the heart and soul of marriage is so important. If we get it wrong, all we'll see is the conflicts about money, about parenting, about sex, about communication. And we'll spend all our energy on negotiating and problem solving and conflict resolution. And we'll never get to something more profound that God desires for our marriages. If there's anything that I've learned in my counseling, it's that it's far more important to get to the deeper issues, the deeper questions that oftentimes go unspoken, but that actually undergird a couple's relationship. Questions that I hear over the years have been, are you there for me when I need you, when I'm weak, when I'm scared? And are you moved to compassion and to care for me? Or how about, do I really matter to you? Am I important to you? In other words, is it a concern to you about me? Or, you know me with all my flaws and my failures. You of all people could reject me. Will you still want to love me? Will you be merciful? Will you leave me? Well, you see, if we miss the essence of marriage, we'll ask all the wrong questions, and frankly, we'll be largely ineffective and limited in our ability to help couples with their marriages. So, here's what I'm going to go after today. First of all, I'm going to go after the foundation of marriage that Scripture gives us, and I'm excited about it. It's something that surprises me every time. Number two, we're going to look at what remarkable gift God gives us to help us in our marriages. And it's the exact same gift that he gives a troubled marriage to rebuild when there's been lots of destruction and devastation. And finally, how do we put legs on what we're talking about? And how do we make it a takeout order so that you and I and the couples we're helping actually can take this and do this out there? So let's jump right in. There's something so fundamental about marriage that's easy to overlook. It gets missed. It starts in Genesis 2 and it travels all the way through the New Testament. In fact, every reference of marriage, almost every reference, alludes back to and builds on this foundation that God gives us. So what's the story? Remember, God takes a rib right from Adam's side, right? Something attached to him. He doesn't create Eve out of the dust of the ground. He takes this part of Adam, a part of his very own body. He takes something that's attached and bound up with Adam. He takes this, fashions Eve, and brings her back to him again. They start out as one flesh, Adam, and then they bring back together into one flesh, Adam and Eve. So God describes marriage with this image of two souls that are bound up with one another. And then comes the climax, or the whole point of the story. In Genesis 2:24, he says, "And therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to," or cling closely to, hold fast to his wife, "and the two shall become one flesh." Now, this is not the first image that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about marriage, but it's something that I'm starting to love. Picture this: two people clinging to each other, gripping tightly, holding, glued to each other, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. Allow your mind to slow this down a little bit, right? We go right through it and go on to the next verse. It's a powerful and vivid metaphor. We don't cling to something we don't need. And we don't cling unless we're in need, unless we are in trouble or scared. Picture a koala bear clinging to its mother, or picture a man adrift at sea holding onto a piece of driftwood for his life. What do we cling to? We cling to what we see is good, what we value, what we treasure, and that we don't want to live without. Or think of the Old Testament. There are many instances where God calls us to cling to Him, cling to His word, cling to His commandments, to His covenants. It's always a positive. In Scripture, it's always a positive metaphor. It's something vivid, active. We cling because we're needy, and we cling because we do not want to live. We cannot live without this. Now, to be sure, there's a difference between clinging and being clingy, right? When I was in high school, all I had to hear was, "No, man, she's clingy." It's over. I mean, it was over. Like, all feelings of attraction were gone at that point, right? God is not talking about clingy. There's a difference between clinging and clingy. There's a difference between holding fast to and strangling or suffocating. And God is not saying that. He's capturing something that is worth slowing down. When you take this verse in the context of Eve coming out of Adam and being reunited to him, and you see how it's used throughout Scripture, the thrust is always towards emotional and spiritual closeness and communion. This is the essence of marriage, a husband and wife clinging together. So the question is, if you're married, how are you clinging? Let me put it this way. Wives, would you say that your husband would say that you need him? Not just for his paycheck, but for his care, for his wisdom, for his compassion. Husbands, would your wife say that you know in the core of your soul, in your being, that you deeply need her and appreciate her? Well, my wife and I were talking sometime this summer, and I was saying, "Kelly, I don't think we can go to the conference. After this conference, we always go together. I said, after this conference, I don't think we're going to be able to keep doing this. We have kids. It just gets harder and harder. How do you live? How do you leave, 5 kids with somebody?" And she says to me, "Okay, what are you thinking?" I said, "I think I'm going to have to go alone." She says, "No way. You go. I'm going. You stay at home with the kids." And actually, she didn't say that, but that's what she was thinking. But what she did say was, "No, Aaron, this is the one time a year that I know that you need me, and I'm not going to miss this. I want to help you." Oh, do you see what she was saying? Do you see what she's saying to me? Aaron, this is the time, and this is the one place that I cannot deny my weakness, is at a conference like this where there's lots of work to be done. There's something very good and powerful that glues us together when we know that we're both needy and needed. So, this is how God describes marriage: the husband and wife clinging to each other. But a marriage that is headed for trouble, or that is in trouble, is a marriage where two people are no longer clinging, no longer close. There's a distance, there's an independence, there's a detachment, and they're living the not good that God described earlier in Genesis 2, even though they're married. And what's tragic is how they deal with this loneliness, this detachment, is actually pushing themselves and pulling further apart. God's design for marriage is that a husband and wife cling together. There's really only three options. Just picture this. You have a husband and a wife who are actively embracing one another, both clinging to each other. That's the first option. Second option is you have one or both spouses with their hands down at their side, right? That's no fun to hug someone like this. Or you have a husband and a wife who are pushing away and they're reaching for something else, someone else. It's one of those three options, and how are we doing? You know, the problem is, you're probably just like me. I like to be independent. I like to be self-sufficient. I like to be strong in and of myself. And God knows that. And so he gives us a remarkable gift that without it, I don't know that many of us would make it. And this is where we keep going in Genesis 2:24. He says the very next clause, he says, and they shall become one flesh, or one body. Now, what he doesn't say is that we will become like one body, right? He says we will become one body. What he's not saying is, oh, this is a cool metaphor. I'm going to describe to my people what it's going to be like. It's a word picture. No. He says, I make you one flesh. It's a reality, spiritually and emotionally. When God takes a man and a woman and they marry, he welds their souls together. Remember what a welder does? A welder takes two pieces of independent metal and he welds the two pieces together so that the joint is actually just as strong as the pieces of metal individually. And the two pieces of metal are now one piece. But God doesn't use a welding metaphor. He uses something much more organic. He says we are now one body. Who we are is wrapped up in the other person. We're inseparably connected. Our souls are bound together. He creates a constructive dependency. This is not a fear of man. This is not a placing my trust in man. It's a reality that we truly are one flesh. And it's something that we can nurture as we cling well together. Now, you're probably thinking, well, why is this a gift? Why is it so important that we understand marriage first and foremost as two souls who are intricately bound up with one another? Well, if I don't see this as the essence of marriage, then my marriage and what I see from the counseling chair is going to be hard for me to see rightly. All I'm going to see is the anger, the conflicts, the defensiveness, the accusations, the criticism, the contemptuousness. You see, if I just see two individuals who are committed together, then I'll see two people that relate and fight like boxers do in a ring, instead of like an autoimmune disorder. Right? What do boxers do? They're just two people slugging it out selfishly, their own desires. Whereas an autoimmune disease is where a body is actually attacking its very own good tissue and joints. It's the difference between getting to the end of our marriage, say it's 20 years or 50 years, and saying, we made it, we did it, we survived. Or saying, I love you. We have clung well together. I am so thankful for you. Now, that's all very abstract. Let me get very specific. Let me give you three implications of why the one flesh union is so important and such a good gift. Well, the first thing is doing marriage ministry is like doing, in my world, is like doing emergency room counseling. If a husband and wife are one flesh, one body, then when they're fighting sinfully and tearing each other apart, it's a body that's tearing apart. That's why marital distress is so painful, so distressing and disorienting and all-consuming. What's interesting is brain studies are now revealing that when a couple is in marital distress, when they're attacking and causing and rejecting one another, the same part of the brain lights up in the exact same ways as if a person is stepping on a nail. Right? When my wife says, Aaron, you're hurting me, that hurts. She's not using a metaphor. It's real. I always pause when I read Job 2. When Satan comes to God the second time and he says, okay, sure, you've taken everything away from this man, but you have not laid a finger on his flesh and blood. You strike his flesh and blood and he will surely curse you to your face. Satan knows something about bodily pain. It's intense. He knows about bodily suffering, that it afflicts us in a very unique way. Well, in the same way, if we really are one flesh, one body, then marital separation and distance and disengagement are going to commandeer our attention, and it's going to hurt really badly. It's emergency room work. And I think that's why marriage work is so intimidating, right? That's why many of us don't want to do it, frankly. It's easier for me to get up here and talk about marriage than it is for me to roll up my sleeves and actually engage and try to help a couple. I still get nervous. Many couples, before I meet with them, I'm intimidated because I know I'm going to enter into a lot of suffering. It's going to be intense. So, the level of pain and anguish we experience in our marriages, the level of distress, makes sense if we are one body. It's a body tearing apart. And I hope that this reality actually creates compassion in my heart as my wife is hurting, and compassion for us as we're ministering to and helping and encouraging other couples. Now let me give you a second implication of this one flesh union. If that's what's at the heart of marriage, it's there because it's God's design, it's His doing, and it's His remarkable gift. It doesn't just magically happen. It's not a product of evolutionary survival. But the world doesn't know this. The leading marital therapist in the world, she spent a lifetime trying to understand and help couples. Well, when she sees this one flesh union and she tries to put it into words, the power of it, listen to what she says. After studying marriage for more than 30 years, I have more respect for the magic of love. Now, she's not talking about infatuation or romance. Listen again. She says, when I watch a distressed couple who's been fighting for 20 years, the megawatt emotions, the pain and the longing, and I watch them change and grow. And when I watch them do that and figure out how to help them do that, it's still magic. It's still magic, and it's still more powerful. Do you see what she's trying to communicate? When she catches a glimpse of the one flesh union that binds two souls together, she doesn't know what it is, but she perceives it. And that's what's kept her doing marriage counseling, doing research study after research study, writing book after book. It's the magic in her mind of this union, even after years of destructive conflict. The world can't understand this powerful and mysterious gift, but we would say it's not magic, it's divine. It's not evolution, it's God's doing. Jesus makes this clear when he says, what God has joined together, let no man separate. This joining that he does actually creates a deep bond, a dependency, and a desire for each other. We emotionally are attached in a profound way. In a difficult marriage, of course, we bury that one flesh union under the thick darkness of destructive conflict. But even then, the desire, the longing is not extinguished because it's God who joined our souls together. Now, oftentimes, I try to help a couple put this into words because it's very healthy for them to hear it. I'm not teaching them, right? But I know it's there. So I'll say something like, Mary, forgive me for asking this, but why? Why do you long for Bill to treasure you and for you to be his special one? See, I know Bill's sitting right here, and it's really good for him to hear this. She chuckles uncomfortably and says, oh man, now you're really pulling out of me. Well, because he's my husband. I don't care what all the other guys think about me. I don't care what my mother thinks about me. He's my husband. See, we're at a loss for words when we try to put it into, to describe why these longings and desires exist. But it's something fundamental where words escape us. Even after we've been married for years, and those years may have been difficult for Mary and Bill, her husband, but the desire remains. And that's why we still can hurt each other like nothing else. No matter how distressed my marriage is, we are one flesh. We impact each other on a very profound level. I long after my wife. Her identity, my identity, is connected, and I yearn for her care. Now, you may be thinking, yeah, right, but I know couples where this isn't the case. Or you may be sitting here and saying, not for me. My husband doesn't have this for me. It's just not there. Well, frankly, that doesn't intimidate me because every day in counseling nearly, I observe this one flesh union, working with couples who have had really challenging marriages. But more importantly, it's in God's word. We have to trust that God doesn't lie and that my marriage or your marriage is not the exception. And it's there. This one flesh union is there to give us hope, even if we don't see any evidence of this. So if that's where you are, if you're saying, no, I don't sense any glue between us, pray that God would blow on the embers of your one flesh to fan it into flames. Ask, is there anything I'm doing, Lord, that is squelching this one flesh union? I have a confession to make. One of my favorite movies is A Walk in the Clouds. Thank you for not laughing. It's a pretty cheesy movie. It was came out in 1995. Keanu Reeves. The story takes place in this beautiful, picturesque wine country in California. And it's on a family vineyard that's been in the family for generations. Keanu Reeves poses as this girl's fiance, and her dad hates him. And one night they get into this big conflict, and the dad's totally drunk, and he's stumbling outside with this kerosene lantern in his hand, and he trips and throws the lantern down, and the entire field starts on fire, which spreads to the entire vineyard. They're trying all night, the entire extended family, to put this fire out because their heritage, their history, their future is all wrapped up in this vineyard. They can't do it. The entire vineyard burns to the ground. The next morning as the sun comes up, the entire family is out there weeping, holding each other, discouraged, despairing. Their lives are over. Their futures have just irrevocably changed. And Keanu Reeves stands up, and you know how he runs? He kind of runs weird. He's running out into the vineyard, and he runs way out to this place where the original vine was planted, where the original plant grew into the entire vineyard. And he rips this smoldering, burnt root out of the ground, and he takes it back to the patriarch, to the grandfather. And the grandfather whips out his knife and cuts a little piece of this root. And his eyes and his countenance change. And he says, it's alive. It's still alive. This is the root of our life. This is the root of our family that can replant. All is not lost. Well, you see, in the same way, the one flesh union is the root from which our marriage grows and is regrown, even if we've burnt the vineyard to the ground. You can see why there's hope. There's always hope. Let me give you a third implication. The reality that a husband and wife are one flesh is absolutely vital to me as a counselor, and hopefully to you as a pastor or to someone who's encouraging another couple in your small group or in your church. You see, when couples are really in trouble, when they're terribly conflicted and at the end of the rope, I have to trust that there's more underneath the surface of this couple's conflict than meets the eye, even if they don't know it. Remember, being one flesh means our souls are connected, our identities, who we are is now connected. So when I work with a husband who's withdrawing, who's stonewalling his wife maybe, and running away, hiding silently, maybe even defensive, I know there's more going on for him than just the selfishness or disinterest or being antisocial. If he's one flesh with his wife, then he's more than avoidant. He may feel like an utter failure in his marriage as a man, before his wife. And under that silence and withdrawing, he probably feels overwhelmed and inadequate and incapable of pleasing his wife. Like he doesn't measure up. And there may be a fearful and silent devastation in his soul as a husband and as a man. You see? The wife doesn't know that. All the wife sees is him withdrawing, his silence, his going out to his man cave again. But I know they're connected. They're souls. So there's more going on than what I can see. Listen over my shoulder to a conversation I had with a couple recently. This is not a unique conversation. They've been married 30 years, and it's been rough. They've been on the brink of divorce, been separated several times in those 30 years. And I've been meeting with them for just about 3 months. Now, when we started this session, the wife was really angry. She was hammering him. And at this point in the conversation, I actually turned to the husband. I say, Juan, when Abby poked her head into your garage and said, we need to talk about this, you said, not now. I don't want to talk about it. What was going on for you? I was mad. I was so upset. Just 15 minutes after our counseling appointment, and she calls me a liar? I wasn't in any mood to talk about it. Right, Juan. This is really important for me to understand. Put yourself back there, back in the kitchen, when Abby came in and said, you lied to Aaron. You lied in counseling. Before the anger, what did you feel? Before the indignation and the defiance set in, slow it down now. What did you feel before you got angry? I don't know. It hurt. I'm there sharing my feelings, doing this counseling thing, and she comes in and tells me I'm lying, that I'm a liar. That hurt. That's right. She hurt you. But why, Juan? Why did it hurt so badly? This feels really silly, but it feels like she's judging me all the time, like she's judging my character, who you are as a man. Yeah. My very own wife doesn't trust me as a man, as her husband. That hurts. Now, at this point, Abby jumps in, and normally I'd intervene because I want to go a little deeper with Juan. But what she asks spontaneously is the exact same thing that I'm thinking and that I'm thinking she's probably thinking. And she simply jumped in with a stunned look on her face. But why? Why did my saying that you lied to Aaron in counseling, why did it hurt that bad? It wasn't. She had no idea. It wasn't even on her radar. And Juan says back to her with a sad look on his face, because I care what you think. You're my wife. And she turned to him and said, I didn't know. I didn't even know I could hurt you, that you even care what I think about you. It's hard for me to trust that this is true. Now look at what's happened. At this point, we're having a very different conversation. Just minutes before, the wife is lambasting her husband for going again, retreating to his man cave, and not caring enough for her to reconcile with him from this conflict. Now we're having an intimate conversation about a husband's humble desire for his wife to esteem him, who he is as a man, his integrity, and of a wife's longing to know that her opinion, her words actually move her husband, that he cares about what she thinks. You see, what Abby sees is a husband who's withdrawing, who's disgusted with her, who doesn't care enough to engage her. She has no idea what's going on underneath the surface. But we're Christians. We are Christians. And we know, armed with God's word, that there's more going on. So in our own marriages, and when we help others with theirs, the real question, the real issue is, will we engage ourselves, our own hearts, and help others to explore on this level of humility and vulnerability? See, all I was doing was slowing down the conflict and inviting Juan to dive beneath the turbulent waters of the conflict. As a counselor, I'm trusting that Abby's view of her husband gets in, matters, deeply impacts him, and vice versa. And as we engage on this level, I'm telling you, these are the most wonderful, moving conversations that we have. So, step back. If we're tracking at this point, you're probably saying with me, okay, I want to cling better to my husband or to my wife. God's given me a powerful gift of being one flesh. But we still haven't talked about how to cling. What is the clinging? How do we hold fast to each other? In Genesis 2, right after God says, and they shall become one flesh, God says something very interesting that I think we tend to gloss over very quickly. But it's the key to clinging. It's the glue that bonds us together, the adhesive. God says, the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Now, we always read this verse, at least I do, and I think, well, yeah, they're not ashamed. They don't have anything to be worried about. They're not afraid. They're not ashamed. There's no sin. I wouldn't be ashamed either. That's kind of nice, but that's not where I live. I don't live in Eden anymore. But we're missing the point. Being naked and not ashamed is actually the way we cling to each other. It's the way we strengthen our one flesh union. And what's fascinating to me is the first time the scripture talks about nakedness, it's a positive thing. It's a wholesome thing. Now, most theologians say this is not primarily about sex. It's about an emotional and spiritual openness and trust between two people. It's inviting and allowing my wife to see me and know me. It's an open-heartedness, a transparency. Yet when God uses the word naked, he perfectly captures our experience. How vulnerable, how exposed we feel, how hard and scary it is. I don't care if you're married to the safest person on the planet, it's still naked, and no one likes to be naked, except for my 5-year-old son. And his older brother. But the nakedness is what makes cleaving possible. Now, we know that God sees it all, right? Hebrews 4:13 says, no creature is hidden from his gaze, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. So God knows, God sees, but it's totally another thing altogether to do it myself, to open myself up to another person, to these softer, humbler, more tender emotions that are essential to clinging and holding fast to each other. My wife Kelly and I were up late one night, really late, and we're talking through something that was really I was struggling with. And I'm trying to find my way through this, and she's listening, and she's encouraging me, and all of a sudden, about 2 hours into the conversation, yes, I'm that high maintenance, 2 hours into the conversation, she says to me, Aaron, I could use a little affirmation right now. I'm like, what? Like this all happens in a matter of 3 seconds in my mind. I'm like, what? Oh man, I've been selfish. I've been talking. She's probably thinking, well, you going to talk all about yourself, until dawn? Like, can I talk about myself too? And or maybe she's thinking, I haven't affirmed her this week very well. Maybe she's just like, Aaron, you've been neglecting me. So I'm starting to get all defensive. 3 seconds, right? I'm starting to get defensive, and by God's grace, I say, Kelly, why do you need affirmation right now? Why are you feeling this way? And she says to me, Aaron, I'm listening to you, and I'm really trying to encourage you, but you're the counselor. I'm not a counselor, and I feel kind of insecure. I don't know if I'm helping you. Oh, man. Can you imagine how that transformed my thoughts and just pulled me to reaffirming and say, Kelly, I love hearing from you and being encouraged by you more than anyone in this world. Right? She did it. She enacted the naked and not ashamed. She could have said a lot of things that would have poked and prodded me or even started a conflict. I was sure we were going to get into a conflict. I'm like, 2 a.m., I don't want to do this, You see, I am compelled towards Kelly when she shows me those more vulnerable emotions, experiences. That's the seedbed out of which intimacy grows and clinging happens. So often in marriage, we're like two hardcover books. When we get into conflict, all we're doing is banging. We're just the defensiveness, the anger, the criticism, the accusations. We're just arguing and quarreling and fighting. But you see, We're like two hardcover books. But books were meant to be opened to each other. Books were meant to be read to one another and to be listened to. But so often neither of us stops to understand what's going on in our own hearts, let alone to listen to hear what's going on in the others. And so nothing changes, right? So part of my job as someone who's encouraging in a marriage is to help them open the covers of their books, to get deeper, to unfold their emotional experiences, to go underneath the anger and the defensiveness, to make sense of it. Because almost always, they're not paying attention. They're not opening their books to one another. Almost always, the anger and defensiveness, the conflict, underneath that, there's more tender and vulnerable emotions like fear, shame, inadequacy, doubts, longings, desires. And when we share those things, that's what tends to pull us towards one another, and it bonds our souls together. It's a compellingly new experience that actually is an antidote that neutralizes and counteracts destructive conflict. So when we see a couple that's really struggling, that's not doing well, we see a couple where they're not reaching anymore, they're not disclosing vulnerable things, emotions. They're still one flesh, but it's a body that's been disconnected, like a body that suffers from leprosy. Remember what leprosy is? It's an infection that's long-standing in the body, and it kills your ability to feel pain. And so you lose parts of your limbs because you repeatedly injure yourself over and over and over until you don't have a foot, you don't have an ankle, you don't have a hand. Paul Brand, the famous neurosurgeon, spent a lifetime studying leprosy and treating it. And he said so many of his patients found it shameful to acknowledge their wounds openly. Listen to what he says. He says, "My leprosy patients no longer felt their hands and feet as part of them. They lacked the basic instinct of self-protection that pain normally provides. One of my patients said to me, my hands and my feet, they don't feel part of me. They're like tools I can use, but they aren't really me. I can see them, but in my mind, they're dead." I heard similar comments often, he says, underscoring the crucial role that pain plays in unifying the human body. Did you hear what he said? In our physical bodies, it's communicating and sensing pain that unifies the body into caring for itself. It's the same thing in marriage. If we're one flesh, we unify as we share these weaker, more painful emotions, the softer longings and fears. And it's reaching out of those fears and caring and responding with compassion and empathy that we cling to one another. But the problem is, we all have this lifelong infection. Your marriage and my marriage suffers from leprosy from one extent to another. And we treat our own bodies, our very own spouse, like a tool, like a co-parent, like a wage earner, a homemaker, everything but our very own body. So a distressed marriage is a leprous marriage. They've become insensitive and inexpressive of the very painful and weaker emotions that bond us together and catalyze us to care for one another. So let's not give up, each of us in this room. Let's be diligent as long as it's called today to be naked and unashamed. That's how we cling. So that's one of my goals as a counselor, is to help a couple to open the pages of their heart. And this often at times is where hope starts to grow. It was early in counseling with Gary and Brenda. They were totally at the end of the rope. I was actually wondering if I'd ever see them again. They were so hurt, angry, and defeated. They'd just gotten back from a Christian conference somewhat like this, and they had both said things that were utterly devastating. And Gary, the husband, was probably angrier than his wife, and he was unreachable, unyielding in the first 10 minutes of the session. So I spent some time challenging him, and the Lord gave him some real conviction for saying that he was going to divorce Brenda, his wife. And so he stands up. It's at the end of the hour. He stands up, and as he's walking out of the room, he looks over at Brenda and he says to her, I was wrong. I shouldn't have said what I said. But I'm looking at him, and there's something different in his face. There's something going on inside for Gary, but I didn't know what it was, and his voice was a little lower. So I said, Gary, can I stop you for a minute? What's happening right now? Your voice is deepening. What are you feeling? And he says, I don't know. I don't know what I'm feeling. But I could see there was something there. And it's in these moments where you have to go deeper, where you have to drive underneath the surface, where you miss a real important opportunity for them to do something different. So I said, Gary, have you ever felt this way before? And he says, yeah, I felt this way at my grandfather's funeral. Gary, can you sit down, please? You're feeling sad. You're feeling grief, aren't you? I think so, but more than anything, what I feel is I feel small. I feel weak. It's like I haven't got it all figured out. Now, I have to tell you, Gary is a successful businessman. He traffics in competence and in confidence. So something is going on here that's new. I say, right, Gary, right. Like you don't know what to do. You're so helpless and sad. I've never seen Gary cry, but he is crying and choking on his words at this point. He said, I feel destroyed. When Brenda says things like, living with you is pure hell. You are the biggest mistake of my life. She hurts me and I feel so unable to please her. But what she doesn't know is I lie awake at night. Not like when I was younger, when I would justify myself all night. I lie awake begging God to forgive me and to help me be a different husband. She hurts me, and I feel so unable to please her, like I'm always a failure. So I say, Gary, would you reach out to Brenda right now? Would you actually hold her hand and tell her directly how badly it hurts when she talks to you like this and when she sees you as a mistake? But he can't. I'm looking at him. He's looking down. We're both looking at his hand, and it's not moving, right? It's like on a chair, and I'm like, oh, great, okay. So I look over at Brenda. I said, Brenda, and she is stunned. She can't believe her eyes and ears, what she's hearing in Gary. It's so genuine. It's what she's been longing for a long time. So I said, Brenda, would you be willing to take Gary's hand and let him know that you're here, that you're listening to what he's saying? Don't even hesitate. She grabs his hand. Gary, share with her now. So through the tears, he says, Brenda, please, don't be my accuser, my judge. Would you trust that I'm trying to change? I know I've made lots of mistakes. But when you say these things, I feel like I'm fighting for my life, for my very existence. And she's weeping at this point, and she says, I know, I don't want to do this. I don't want to hurt you like this. I am so messed up, Gary. I'm wrecked. Please, don't leave me. Don't leave me. What happened here? It was Gary's tone of voice, his facial expressions. That was the first sign that there was more than indignation and anger and defeat. Simply slowing the conflict down right there in the moment, not moving on without helping Gary to make sense of what was going on inside of him and to share that vulnerably, humbly. See, up until that point, it was all anger and rage. But by God's grace, he was able to help him acknowledge and explore what he was feeling but didn't understand, to get into the pain, to get underneath the anger and the indignation, to say, Brenda, please don't do this to me. I'm dying. And you see how when Gary went there, how that invited Brenda to her own vulnerable place, for her own, taking her actions serious. She didn't apologize for what she said to him up until that point. And even for her to say, Gary, I am scared to death that you will leave me, even though I said that I don't want you to leave me. Gary's vulnerability elicited Brenda's empathy and her own transparency. And by God's grace that day, they clung together. They were naked and not ashamed. And this became one of the many doorways for them into a new relationship. Well, let's pause to review. God's design for marriage is a husband and wife who are both clinging together and growing in one flesh union that he so graciously gifted us with. And when we understand what that one flesh union is, it gives us real hope, real focus in our marriage and the marriages that we're ministering to. And yet it's just as hard, it's not any easier for you than as it is for me to cling in a way that's naked and not ashamed before one another, in a way that transforms our conflicts and fosters deep communion. But there's one question, if you're like me, you may not be, it's maybe a nerdy question, but there's one question that's on my mind, and that is, okay, Aaron, so what are you asking? Are we just trying to recover Eden? Are we just trying to get back to the garden, back to the way it was there? Is that the goal in marriage? No. Because when God penned these words in Genesis 2, he always had something else, someone else in mind. From the very beginning, they didn't know it. In Ephesians 5, Paul quotes Genesis 2 saying, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." And then he says something fascinating. He says, this is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. Can you believe this? Genesis 2:24 and 25. We're always about Jesus and his bride. No one could imagine that for thousands of years, that when God said that a husband would cling to his wife and become one flesh with her, that it was more than about Adam and Eve. The Father all along was pointing us to his Son, who would leave his father, who would leave his home, and would cling to, hold fast to his bride, we the church. Jesus clings to whom? To his treasure, to that which he loves and values. He's the one who says, it is a concern to me about you. I know your failures. I know your sin, your wretchedness, and I love you, and I will never forsake you. I will hold you fast to the end. Jesus is the one who epitomizes being naked and unashamed, who shares with us his heart, his mind, his life, who makes himself utterly vulnerable, leaving the safety of heaven, dwelling amongst us, walking amongst us, living where we live. He's the one who holds us fast. And it's Jesus who became one flesh with us in such a way, like John Calvin says, my favorite quotation. He says, he actually considers himself incomplete and reckons himself imperfect until we are reunited with him in glory. Amazing. It's not that he's lacking or deficient in and of himself. Of course not. It's that in love, he has become one flesh with us. And now his identity is so wrapped up in us and his bride that he considers himself incomplete until we dine together at the wedding feast. So, what's our ultimate goal in marriage? Is to reflect or to be a parable of Christ's love for his bride. Imagine that your marriage and my marriage are parables. And as we grow to cling to one another in a Christ-honoring, Christ-reflecting way, this deepens our one flesh union, and it pulls and points others and gives us and others a compelling glimpse of another union, the eternal union that Christ forged with us, his bride. Imagine, he clings to us. He holds us fast.